Okay, hello again. We're here for part two of this Tamerlane chess series. In part one, I left off by telling you the moves of all the pieces and their positions on the board. I'm just going to backtrack for a minute and tell you the story of how Tamerlane, the man, got his name, Tamerlane, because he was born Timur, Timur, in what today is Uzbekistan. And when he was either an adolescent or a young adult, he sustained major injuries to his right leg and his right arm. Some historians think he got these injuries when he was shot by a shepherd with an arrow when Timur was trying to steal the shepherd's sheep. And some other historians think he got the injuries when he was a little older in a battle, when he was fighting for a local tribal khan when he was young. However that happened, he sustained these injuries, which left him crippled for the rest of his life, and that earned him the name Tamerlane. Because he would walk around a little bit wobbly and he was a little lame, and so they called him Tamerlane, which translated into Timur the Lame. And in English, this was corrupted into Tamerlane. Timur the Lame. That's how he got his name. Now, I started by describing some of the pieces and how they came about with their what was supposed to depict this. The rook is two horse heads pulling a chariot. The knight depicts a horse. I'll kind of describe this with many of the other pieces now too. The pill or elephant is meant to look like an abstraction of two tusks, two elephants' tusks here. I don't know what you thought these were, but get your minds out of the gutter. They're two tusks. And sorry, that was a joke that I stole from a man named Rick Knowlton, who's a chess historian and author. All right, this piece here, the Shah, the king. One thing that, kings and emperors have changed a lot over the centuries in their function and their behavior. But one thing that I think we can all say is probably in common with all kings and emperors over history is that when they travel long distances, they don't walk. Their transportation is usually provided for them. So in ancient Persia, a king would have ridden on an elephant covered by a carriage. So the bottom part of this piece here, this rounded piece right here, is meant to depict an elephant, and this upper piece here is the carriage on the back of the elephant. The king would ride in the carriage, as royalty would. That's what this piece represents. Now, the minister and the advisor, same thing. They were royalty. They'd ride on the back of an elephant in a carriage. I made it a little different here so you could tell the difference between the pieces. And same thing with the advisor. He is an elephant with a carriage on top. And then we'll go on to describe a few more of the pieces. Now, we're going to get into the pieces that are unique to Tamerlane chess that really are found in almost no other game. And they are these four pieces here, which are the camel, Jamel, the Dababa, the Talia, and the giraffe. They are pieces that are found occasionally in other places, but they're pretty unique to Tamerlane chess, and there's no depictions of them online of what they look like that I can find, no pictures. And now Tamerlane chess is only known from one ancient manuscript, which was probably written in the 15th, maybe 16th century, maybe by a man by the name of Ali, the chess player. Ali Astrangi, it would translate into Ali, the chess player. He was a chess player in the 14th century that was played often at Tamerlane's court, and he was considered a very good chess player. He may have been the author of this manuscript, which is the only manuscript that we know the rules of Tamerlane chess from. This manuscript was lost for hundreds of years until it was discovered in the late 1600s by a man named Thomas Hyde, and then was translated and became known to the world again. Otherwise, we would not know the rules of Tamerlane chess. They were lost. So in this manuscript, these four pieces are described, descriptions are given, and I based my model on those descriptions from a translation of the manuscript I found. The Jamel or camel was described as having a hump, head, and neck, but no legs. So there's how I made that one. The Dababa was described as being a six-sided inkstand with a cap. So I made him like that. The Talia or scout was described as being a elephant, the two tusks, but with two faces. So there's the one face and there's the other. So that's how I made him based on the description. Elephant with two faces, and the giraffe is described as being a horse but with two faces. A knight but with two faces. There's one face, there's the other. That's how I made those pieces. Now, a giraffe was kind of a silly piece to add. It wasn't never used in battle in ancient Persia, giraffes. But elephants and camels were sometimes used for transportation and other reasons in battle, for transferring supplies and people, and even in battle attacking. The elephant, which is actually over here, the elephant was we call a war elephant, was also used to stampede and to carry soldiers on its back who would then run through and shoot with arrows and other things. So an interesting quick story of Tamerlane is that when he was on a campaign into India and attacking Delhi, the Sultan of Delhi actually had a bunch of war elephants to try to intimidate Timur's army with dozens of these elephants. Timur responded by setting the backs of his own camels on fire. He put hay on their backs, set them on fire, and they thus ran into the enemy's war elephants. The war elephants got spooked, stampeded their own men. Timur's army charged, they won the battle, and then they massacred the entire city of Delhi by lighting his own camels' backs on fire. That's just a little bit of history of how some of these historical pieces came about in battle and what they really represented, the camels and the elephants. Okay, so now I want to get in a little bit into the meat of the game, and I want to talk about pawn promotion. Pawn promotion means that when the pawn gets to the far side of the board, he becomes a piece. The pawns always promote to the piece they represent. So the pawn of giraffes always promotes to a giraffe. So when he gets to the other side of the board, no matter what file he happens to be in when he gets there, he promotes to a giraffe. Now the two exceptions to that are the pawn of pawns and the pawn of kings right here. Now I'll tell you what they promote to briefly. The pawn of kings promotes to a piece called a prince instead of a king. Now the prince has the same moves as the king. He moves one square in every direction. But when a prince exists on the board simultaneously with a king, they're kind of like two kings existing at the same time. That means one king must be captured like a regular piece before the other one, the last remaining one, can then be checkmated or stalemated to end the game of chess. So when the prince exists on the board simultaneously with the Shah or the prince can then be captured like a regular piece until the last one remaining, which then has to be checkmated or stalemated. So that's what the pawn of kings promotes to, a prince. Now this next section is very complicated. The promotion rules for the pawn of pawns are extremely complicated. You'll have to bear with me here. I'll try to make it as painless as possible. When the pawn of pawns reaches the far end of the board a first time, he becomes immune in that square. He cannot be attacked in that square. He becomes immune there. And he sits there until one of the following cases arises. He sits there until two of his enemy's pieces somewhere on the board can be captured by a pawn in a forking technique. So what that means is, let's say he has his giraffe. These are the opponent's pieces, we'll say. His giraffe is here and his camel is here. Now, pawns, we know, attack diagonally. So that means if I put a pawn here, he's now forking these two pieces. He will get one of them because they both can't escape. He's attacking the camel this way, he's attacking the giraffe this way. So if on the next move the opponent decides to move his camel away, now he can get the giraffe. So one of these pieces is doomed because he can't move both away on the same turn. So that's what's called a pawn forking two pieces. So when he's sitting up here in his immune square after arriving to the far side of the board the first time, he sits there until that situation arises where he can fork two pieces, and he immediately must move to that square where he can get those forked pieces. Or he sits there until one of his opponent's pieces becomes immobile and cannot escape the attack of a pawn. So let's say over here on the side of the board, the opponent's elephant sits. Now remember, elephants only move two squares diagonally. So the only two squares he can move from here are that square or that square. Two squares diagonally. So if those pieces are occupied by his own men, let's say we put that there and that there, he's now trapped. He can't move because all the squares where he can move are occupied. So that piece is immobile. So the pawn's sitting up here waiting for either a fork or an immobile piece. If he sees that situation arrive, he must move the pawn to there where he can now attack on his next move that immobile piece. And he's bound to do that. The rules state that he must move there when one of those situations arrives. It's not a choice. Now it gets even more complicated because even if this piece is occupied at the time, even if this piece has a piece sitting on it, let's say this Dababa is sitting there, if these two pieces can be forked, the pawn still moves here, bumps that piece out of the way, it gets removed from the board. Whether or not this piece is a friendly piece, one of the player's own pieces, or an opponent's piece, either one, whether it's friendly or opponent, if it's sitting on that attacking square or on the attacking square of the immobile piece, it gets bumped, taken off the board as if it was captured, and the pawn goes there. The only exception is if it happens to be a sole king, a king on the board that is the only king for that player. If he's sitting there, then the pawn cannot move there, because that would be like capturing a sole king, which can't be done. So the pawn moves there when one of those two situations arises, and then on his next move he can attack whatever piece he's attacking, and then he continues to move along as a pawn again. If he reaches the far side of the board for a second time, then at that point he immediately moves to the original square of where the pawn of kings sits. So this is the king, this is the pawn of kings. He immediately moves to that original square on the second time he gets to the far side of the board. If this piece is occupied, same thing. He takes it anyway. If there's a piece sitting there, it doesn't, whether it's a friendly piece or an opponent's piece, if it's occupied, it's bumped off the board and he moves to that piece, to that square. Then he continues moving forward as a pawn a third time. If he reaches the far side of the board a third time, he now becomes known as what's called the adventitious king. It's another form of a king. So we have three types of kings that can be on the board: the regular king, the prince, which comes from the pawn of kings, or the adventitious king, which only arises on the board by that complicated mechanism I just told you. That's the only way an adventitious king comes on the board. The adventitious king moves like a king and a prince, one square in any direction. Same thing, if he exists on the board simultaneously with a prince and or a king, all of the types of kings must be captured like a regular piece until only one remains, which then can be checkmated or stalemated. The adventitious king also has a special privilege, which has to do with the citadels, which I'll explain in the next video. So that was a little complicated. You might have to listen to that a couple times to absorb it, but that is the promotion rule for the pawn of pawns. And I think we'll stop here, and in the next video we will talk about the citadels. Thank you.